Welcome to the Hero's Road. I'm so excited to have you because this is a place I've been working on to get to for a long time as an astrologer, as an astrological thinker, as someone who treats life as a game of evolution and trying to figure out how I can show up and play the best game I can. So, what is this episode about? This is about helping you go on the adventure of understanding your own astrology for yourself and learning to really speak it as a language because astrology is the language of conscious evolution. It's the language of evolution. It's the language of how the algebra of change happens in the world. So we're going to go into a bunch of topics in this episode, but let me set the stage for where we are. This is a 12-part series that I'm inviting you on, and I'm calling it The Road to Adventure, and it's got 12 stops. We're going to get into why you are about to embark upon the greatest adventure available to you in understanding your astrology. Not just because astrology, because it's going to help you become more human and get more out of life. We're going to talk about how astrology is the language of archetypes. We're going to talk about how your chart is the architecture of your consciousness. It's the boardroom of your psyche, and you're going to sit down and speak to all of the characters that make up the architecture of your inner world and how to work with them, how to get them to become your allies. Then we're going to talk about your transits. Your transits are the seasonal GPS of how different parts of you come online through the adventure of your life. They initiate you into meeting different parts of yourself and helping you call up different parts of your mastery through practicing in your real. We're going to meet two characters on the boardroom of your psyche. We're going to meet your Mars placement and we're going to meet your Venus placement. We're going to talk about how your Mars is that energy inside of you that begins, that initiates, that takes action, that goes and builds the thing. And then we're going to meet your Venus, the feminine side of you, which has nothing to do with gender. We're talking about energy inside of yourself. And it's really helpful and fascinating to understand the different polarities that you have inside of you. It's a very fascinating planetary pairing to unpack, and it really creates an evolutionary loop in yourself, in the world around you, in communities. So we're going to talk about it as it pertains to your chart. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my Mars and my Venus and how they're very different energies, but the way they work together fascinates me. And as I've learned to understand my own chart more, it really has made an intense difference in how I show up and what I end up receiving. Then I'm going to give you an experiment to run in your own life over the next week, because this is your invitation to living the hero's road. And when I say hero, I mean, I'm not talking about that you got to go save the world. You don't. What I'm talking about is you can think of yourself as the hero in your own life. And adopting that perspective, adopting that mentality will absolutely change your life. So we're going to talk about what that means. So let's get into the first piece that I want to kind of call up. Like, why understanding astrology in your own life is so important and can truly help you change your life if you learn to do it. So I think that most people relate to astrology as if it's somehow some language that gives you categories for your personality or predictions for things that are going to happen in your life. And that's just not how I engage with astrology. The way I invite you to think about it is it's a language that you can learn for yourself that helps you participate in your own becoming. Astrology is not just something that you can use to describe yourself. Astrology is something that you can use to develop yourself. And that is fascinating. Okay, so let's get into this. Let us speak this out into the universe and say, I want to go on the greatest adventure available to me in this life. I want to discover the particular genius that is trying to emerge through me. I want to go on all the side roads. I want to spend the time required to cultivate that genius. I want to build the internal and external capacities that are required to begin expressing it consistently. And I want to develop those capabilities into genuine mastery. And then I want to create a life that is really reflective of the values that I've decided are truly mine, the values that I find meaningful and truly beautiful. This is where I think astrology is so valuable. So let's talk about purpose. Purpose isn't just like, oh, I found the best career, and I'm going to do that. It's not necessarily like, oh, the Pleiadians told me I have this one cosmic assignment that I've got to make sure I do before I die. What I really think purpose is developing a relationship between what do you value? What are you capable of building realistically? And how can you continue growing your capacity to build more? And what is life asking you to learn? And what would the larger world benefit from if you expanded your own particular capacity and genius? What I think is the most fascinating, greatest adventure you can go on is that you learn to become increasingly capable of expressing the genius that is already latent within you. And I am betting that it is something that the universe has never seen before. So, your purpose isn't just a prize that's hidden at the end of some road. I think it's something that you develop the capacity to embody through time as you move along your road. So, with that said, how do we begin seeing something as like amorphous and vast and potentially as invisible as our own potential and our own genius? We need a language for it. We deserve a language and a tool to begin this discovery. And that is where the archetype enters our sphere. So let's talk about this piece, astrology as a language of archetypes. So, what even is an archetype? Because that word gets thrown around. An archetype is a universal pattern. It's a symbol, but it's kind of like an umbrella, and it covers a lot of things. It's something that can appear across cultures, and you'll find them all across global myth. You'll find them in relationships, in psychology, everywhere in ordinary life. What it is a pattern that can operate through many different levels of consciousness. There are levels to the frequencies. You can find within one single archetype the lowest expression, and then as you travel up the spiral, higher expressions, higher and higher and higher, all the way from the shadow to the gift to the superpower and anywhere in between. What we're kind of asking for as a practice of astrology is to understand the frequency of all of the archetypes within us and practice moving the level that we generally stay at higher and higher over time without being mean to ourselves about it, because life takes practice. So remember this, everything in your chart is an archetype. All of the planets are archetypes. All of the houses represent an archetype, as well as a sphere of experience in life. All of the aspects are a type of archetype. So you are really dealing with a language board, a symbolic board of the potential of who you came to become in this lifetime when we look at your chart. Any archetype can show up as the unconscious version. Any archetype can be the compulsive, defensive, version that is trying to develop. And we don't need to shame any of them, because you got to start somewhere. And so the angelic version of any archetype had to come through the unconscious version to start. So there's this process of developing any archetype that you have within you, being intentional about how you explore that archetype. And eventually, through practice and experience, this is where your transits will come in. They will show you how to integrate that archetype into your life. And then eventually one day, the goal is that you have become a master of the frequency of that archetype that is the most beautiful to you. Okay, so let's get into your actual placements. What I want you to understand about Mars is that it is this initiating function within you. And so when you understand how you initiate in the world, the way you can move, the way you can create becomes highly powerful, because as we talked about earlier with archetypes being mentors, you are taking time to install the wise version of how your Mars wants to become into your intuition, into your waking, conscious, working mind. And so then you start to understand how your desire moves in you. You start to understand how energy in you gets released into the world. How do you assert yourself? How do you move away from things that no longer fit? How do you initiate yourself into new levels? How do you pursue your goals? How do you protect what is yours to protect? And in general, like, what is the flavor through which you take action? And all of that detail, all of that nuance is going to come to you through not just understanding that basic framework of Mars as an archetype, but how does the sign that your Mars is in add layers of flavor to that. And then when it comes to the house that your Mars is in, that is where your Mars is going to show up and gain particular pieces of experience and themes in your life that resonate as huge themes of your development in life. And it doesn't mean that your Mars only works in that one sphere of experience, but I'm guessing that over the course of your life, you're going to have particular chapters that really speak to how your Mars wanted to engage with that sphere of life experience, of creative energy. And I think there's a deeper layer we can go into in this, and why it's so beneficial to understand your own Mars, because there is this societal template kind of rigidity that we get into when we think of you know the idea of the archetype of action, which Mars encompasses that. But all, all this productivity advice online like assumes that everybody just takes action the same way, and that's just not true. Obviously, people can struggle because they hear the drumbeat of productivity advice and thinking that they can just like move at the pace somebody else is designed to move at, or use somebody else's motivational structure, or adopt somebody else's idea of discipline. I am never going to wake up at 5 a.m. I'm not going to criticize myself for that. And so forcing yourself through somebody else, some like internet guru's idea of a method to take action, is fighting your nature. So that's why I think understanding your own Mars, it's not that it's going to excuse you from action. What it's going to do is help you develop a way of being, a method of action that actually works with the way you're designed to work. But just to wrap up the Mars energy, I want you to think about things of like, how do you naturally begin? What gets energy to bubble up and rise up in you? And do you act immediately, or do you wait for momentum to build up and then you kind of gradually take action? What causes you to be reactive? What causes you to feel like you need to compete with anybody else? Do you have compulsive energy around anything in your life? What actions do you take that you feel are very purposeful? What is valuable enough for you to take action that takes a long time? Action without a relationship to true value can create empty emotion. And so, Mars needs direction. It needs to know what is worth building. And that is where we get into the topic of your Venus. Venus is the part of you that recognizes value, that understands what's beautiful, that is your brand of understanding what attracts you. Not just what do you find beautiful and what do you find valuable, but what gives you pleasure. But here's another little layer to the archetype of Venus. Venus is a very receptive energy. It's your feminine energy. You can think of Venus as like the beehive, that it's the honey. It is what processes through the action that Mars brings to you. So if you think of Mars as like the bees that go out and pollinate all the flowers and gather pollen, and then they have to bring them back to the beehive. The beehive is there to receive the pollen that Mars has gone out and collected all over the place. And then the honey gets made through processing that action, through the process of assimilating experience. So as we live, love, be in a relationship with people and it works out one way or works out another way, or we go on grand side quests of creating, or we succeed at something, or we fail. I mean, failing is an absolutely rich experience of assimilating, finding what we find valuable. Venus is gradually getting to discover like what looked beautiful from a distance, is that really something we want to engage with? And all of that gives you this accumulated experience through life of knowing what matters to you. And I think that is so important for living a sustainable life that creates a life that is built on your values. So I'm going to walk you through this evolutionary cycle of Mars and Venus and this evolutionary loop. Mars feels the desire and it wants to go initiate through impulse. Mars sends energy outward through action. Then that action encounters reality. It reacts to whatever's going on. And from that, something is going to come back because an action always invites a reaction. What comes back could be pleasure, friction, a relationship, a disappointment. It could be beauty, money, consequence, feedback. But then Venus turns that encounter into something it meaning makes. It finds what's valuable. It refines its taste. It develops relational intelligence. It accumulates wisdom through the experience of receiving what Mars goes out and does. If it's informed, consistently informed through the Venus value stack and standard bearer of your value, then your Mars is going out there and taking action with greater consciousness. And that is just going to build better, more valuable, more longer lasting things for you in your life. And so Mars without Venus, it just keeps acting without learning any of the lessons. It just keeps repeating the same mistake. It thinks like going out and doing anything is the same as progress. And then Venus without Mars, so this desire to have value and beauty, but without the capacity to act, it might know what it wants, but it never goes and builds it. It might accumulate things that it has a taste for. It might dream. It might have a lot of desire. And it might sit around waiting for beauty to arrive. And so what we're actually looking for is a Mars that builds in devotion to your Venus, and then your Venus is willing to teach Mars what is worth building next. This is two different pieces of our intelligence working together in a creative feedback loop, because we've got desire and we have value, but the desire is constantly informed by our ever-growing wisdom of what we value. And so I think when you can have this symbolic understanding of those two polarities, you are truly set up for a fascinating experiment in this life. So I will super quickly tell you about my own Venus and my Mars so you can kind of get a flavor of how this works. My Mars is in Capricorn in the first house. I can't help but take action. I can't help but be out here planning stuff, wanting to build things. Capricorn is the sign of the builder. It is the mountain goat that will try and climb any mountain just step by step by step by step. And so that really, and given that it's in my first house, I cannot get away from this energy. It's not somewhere just laying off in the distance. It is part of my personality all day long. It's foundationally in the very front part of my consciousness. So I act methodically. I want to build structure. I want to bring order to chaos. I can sustain long-term effort. I want to see tangible progress. I'm self-directed. And I develop my authority through experience. I can turn an ambitious vision into an operating system. But again, because everything is a frequency and we all have our shadows and our gifts, I can be hard on myself. I can be stubborn. I can think I know better than you. And so I've had to get real about all of that stuff, because if I don't consciously ask the Mars in me to say, well, what is the master version of Mars in Capricorn in the first house? Not just the grindy Captain Ahab, dusty old sea captain who's like, we must keep going forward. That energy gets tiring and it can burn you out. And so I have had to ask my Venus, I have gotten to ask my Venus, well, if I have this long haul energy, what is worth devoting that long haul energy to? And that is where my Venus in Scorpio in the 11th house, that is totally conjunct my Sun in Scorpio, is very close to my Mercury and very close to my Jupiter, says, well, we value depth over surface. It's also in the 11th house of collective transformation. I am so interested in the dynamics of how does the story of humanity go from looking around the world and seeing all of the pain, all of the chaos, all of the war, all of the ways that we look out into the world and say, this is not the most beautiful world that we desire. And how do we go on a big collective journey of changing that? And I don't have the answer. But I know that that is what I value. I want profound and honest engagement around that topic. I want to understand what draws people to want to change and what actually helps them change. I just find so much beauty in the potential of human transformation, not just on an individual level, but on a collective level. And so that that kind of sphere of values is what informs my Mars. As I understood my astrology and understood my chart and I understood this relationship between the Mars and the Venus, they became partners. And my life is completely different now that I act from that place. And so that's why I invite you to go check into your own chart and start understanding this relationship for yourself. So as we wrap this up, because y'all know I can yap, do this experiment for yourself over the next week. Take a look at your Venus and say, what beauty or value is your Venus asking you to cultivate? Where in your life does it matter most? And where do you need to be more capable of receiving? Then ask your Mars, how does your Mars naturally take action? And then what is one action that your Mars could take in the next few days that starts to actually articulate the way your Venus values beauty and your Mars is willing to show up and build that for her? And just see what comes back. And so, where do you go next if you are interested in this dynamic of relating to the world? If you want to understand your own astrology better so that you can start to have this deeper, more nuanced, more meaning filled conversation with the universe and the entire living field around you, and understand the entirety of your map of archetypes and start to use them to understand yourself better and start to have your psyche feel like a synthesized, swirling mandala of purpose. That is why I built the Hero's Road. It is my new app from Starlight. It is the evolution of everything I've ever created astrologically to help you stay in conversation with your own chart, to help you track every personal natal transit you've ever had and or going to have, to layer in your goals, because there is a goal setting piece inside the Hero's Road. There is a journal section. You can chat with any part of your hero's story, birth chart, biography. You can chat about any transit you're going through. You can get deep dives on any transit. It is a full spectrum platform that lives in your phone. You can use it on your computer that allows you to just stay in the conversation with your astrology, which to me means staying in the conversation with life. This is the question I ask myself as someone with Venus and Scorpio in the 11th house. And that is why my Mars in Capricorn is consistently staying in devotion to building these tools that my Venus in Scorpio in the 11th house wants to have, because they're all about collective transformation. But we can have no collective transformation if we don't understand how to transform ourselves as individuals first and foremost. And so I wonder out into the world aloud under these big oak trees here in the middle of Texas, what would the world feel like? What would being in relationship with your friends and neighbors and people online be like if more of us were gardening ourselves, meeting our archetypes, understanding what we value, and then working to build what we value? When we understand how to do that ourselves, we naturally start to begin to develop the capacity to work in greater and greater levels of synthesis and power with people around us. And that is the moonshot dream of why I'm an astrologer. I want you to understand how to change your own life, but I want you to hold this as a moonshot for yourself. When you go on the journey of cultivating your own genius, how does it become something that first takes care of you? Because you have to get your own sovereignty. What will sustain the values, the beauty, and cultivate the kind of life you want to live? And then when you get to live that way long enough, your genius becomes available to be contributed to the world story. That is why I'm an astrologer. And that is the work I'm doing. And I think you can see me living out my chart in what I'm putting out into the world. And so I ask you, what would the world look like if you put your values out into the world and your Mars goes out and builds them over the long haul? All right, that's enough for today. Stay tuned for the next drop that you'll get in a few days. Cheers.